The salt-laced wind whipped around Arthur's worn denim jacket as he stood on the crest of the dune. The endless expanse of the Atlantic stretching before him like a bruised canvas. Seabrook, nestled between the unforgiving sea and the whispering pines, was precisely as isolated as he'd hoped it would be. Solitude, in its rawest form, was what he craved, what he needed to smother the embers of grief that still burned within him. 3 years after the accident. 3 years. A lifetime, and yet just yesterday. The image of Sarah, her vibrant smile frozen forever in his memory, haunted his every waking moment. The screech of tires, the sickening crunch of metal, the deafening silence that followed, a loop he couldn't escape. He'd sold their bustling Chicago brownstone, packed a meager suitcase, and fled to this forgotten corner of the world, a place he'd found on a map with a name that promised peace. Seabrook was small, a cluster of weathered houses clinging to the coastline, populated by fishermen, retirees, and those who, like himself, were seeking refuge from something. He'd bought a dilapidated cottage overlooking the ocean, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. He spent his days wandering the deserted beaches, the rhythmic roar of the waves a constant monotonous soundtrack to his sorrow. He avoided the friendly, curious glances of the townsfolk, retreating further into the shell he'd built around himself. Arthur was a ghost in Seabrook, a phantom haunting the shoreline. He existed, but he didn't live. One blustery Tuesday evening, a flyer plastered haphazardly to the community bulletin board outside the local general store caught his eye. It was faded and rain-streaked, barely legible, but the words "Seabrook Community Orchestra, all instruments welcome," jumped out at him. Arthur hadn't touched his cello in 3 years. Before Sarah, music had been his life, his passion, his voice. He'd played with renowned orchestras, toured the world, felt the exhilarating power of sound surge through him. But after the accident, the cello had become a painful reminder of what he'd lost. Sarah had loved listening to him play. Her laughter, her encouragement, her sheer joy in his music, all gone. The cello sat in its case in a corner of the cottage, gathering dust, a silent testament to his broken heart. He almost dismissed the flyer. What was the point? He was rusty, out of practice, emotionally drained. And the thought of being around people, of sharing something so personal, filled him with anxiety. Yet something in the flyer's unassuming invitation resonated deep within him. A flicker of something long dormant, a tiny ember of hope began to glow. He ripped the flyer from the board and folded it carefully into his pocket. The Seabrook Community Orchestra met in the town hall, a modest brick building that had seen better days. As Arthur stood outside, the sounds of discordant tuning drifted through the cracked windows, a chaotic symphony that both intrigued and intimidated him. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Was he ready for this? Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The room was a kaleidoscope of mismatched chairs, music stands, and people, old and young, seasoned musicians, and enthusiastic amateurs. They were a motley crew. A woman with fiery red hair was wrestling with a violin that seemed determined to stay out of tune. A teenager with bright pink headphones around his neck was nervously tapping his foot. An elderly gentleman with a twinkle in his eye was polishing his trombone with meticulous care. At the front of the room, a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile stood on a small platform, patiently trying to bring order to the chaos. This was Eleanor, the conductor, and the heart and soul of the Seabrook Community Orchestra. "Welcome," she said, her voice carrying easily over the din. "Come on in. Don't be shy. We're always happy to have new faces." Arthur felt 100 pairs of eyes turn towards him. He shuffled awkwardly into the room, feeling like an intruder. He hadn't been around so many people in years. Eleanor approached him, her smile unwavering. "You must be new," she said. "I'm Eleanor. What's your name and what do you play?" "Arthur," he mumbled, his voice hoarse from disuse. I used to play the cello." Eleanor's eyes lit up. "A cello? Wonderful! We're always in need of a good cello player. We've only got Mrs. Henderson, and bless her heart, her arthritis is acting up lately. Please, grab a seat. We're just about to start." Arthur found an empty chair in the cello section, next to a woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She gave him a friendly nod. He felt a surge of nervousness as he reached for his cello case, the familiar way to comfort in the unfamiliar. Opening the case, he inhaled the rich, woody aroma of the instrument. It was like greeting an old friend after a long absence. He carefully lifted the cello from its velvet lining, his fingers instinctively tracing the curves of its body. As he began to tune the strings, the familiar vibrations resonated through him, a faint echo of the passion he thought he'd lost forever. The first few notes were shaky and uncertain, his fingers clumsy and out of practice. But as he continued to play, the muscle memory returned, slowly but surely. The notes flowed a little easier, the sound a little richer. He closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him, drowning out the self-doubt and the lingering grief. The orchestra began to play a simple arrangement of a Mozart sonata. It wasn't perfect, far from it. There were missed notes, timing issues, and the occasional squeak. But there was also a palpable sense of joy, of shared passion, of community. Arthur found himself drawn into the music, his cello blending with the other instruments to create a tapestry of sound. He glanced at Eleanor, who was conducting with an infectious enthusiasm. Her face was alight with joy, her movements graceful and precise. He watched the other musicians, their faces etched with concentration, their bodies swaying to the rhythm. He saw the red-haired violinist struggling with a particularly difficult passage, but her determination was unwavering. He saw the pink-haired teenager tapping his foot with renewed energy, his initial nervousness replaced with focused intensity. For the first time in years, Arthur felt a sense of belonging. He was no longer a ghost, a solitary figure haunting the shoreline. He was part of something bigger, something beautiful, something meaningful. He was a musician again. Over the next few weeks, Arthur became a regular member of the Seabrook Community Orchestra. He dusted off his old sheet music, practiced diligently, and slowly regained his confidence. He started to talk to the other musicians, learning their names, their stories, their struggles. He discovered that the red-haired violinist, whose name was Clara, was a single mother struggling to make ends meet, but she found solace in the music. The pink-haired teenager, named Liam, was shy and awkward, but he came alive when he played his clarinet. The elderly gentleman with the trombone, Mr. Peterson, had been playing in orchestras for over 60 years and had a wealth of stories to share. Through these connections, Arthur began to heal. He realized that he wasn't alone in his suffering. Everyone carried their own burdens, their own griefs, their own hopes and dreams. Sharing his music, sharing his experiences, helped him to lighten the load. Eleanor, in particular, became a close friend. She recognized the pain in his eyes, the sadness that clung to him like a shadow. She never pried, but she offered a listening ear and a gentle, supportive presence. They would often talk after rehearsals, sharing cups of tea and discussing everything, from music theory to the meaning of life. One evening, as they were walking along the beach, the moon casting a silvery glow on the water, Eleanor turned to Arthur and said, "You know, Arthur, music has a way of healing us, of connecting us to something larger than ourselves." Arthur nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I'd forgotten how powerful it could be," he said. "I'd let my grief silence me." "Grief is a powerful force," Eleanor said softly. "It can consume us if we let it, but it doesn't have to define us. We can find ways to live with it, to learn from it, to grow from it." Her words resonated deeply within him. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the strength and compassion in her eyes. He realized that he was drawn to her not just because of her musical talent, but because of her genuine kindness and her unwavering belief in the power of human connection. As the weeks turned into months, Arthur and Eleanor grew closer. They discovered a shared love of classical music, of literature, of long walks on the beach. They found comfort in each other's company, a quiet understanding that transcended words. One day, after a particularly moving rehearsal, Eleanor invited Arthur back to her house for dinner. She lived in a cozy cottage filled with books, music, and the aroma of freshly baked bread. They spent the evening talking, laughing, and sharing. "Eleanor," he said, his voice barely a whisper, I care about you very much." Eleanor smiled, her eyes sparkling in the candlelight. "I care about you too, Arthur," she said, "more than you know." He leaned in and kissed her, a tentative, hesitant kiss at first, then growing bolder, more passionate. It was a kiss filled with hope, with healing, with the promise of a new beginning. Over time, their relationship blossomed. Arthur found himself falling in love with Eleanor, a love that was different from what he had shared with Sarah, but no less real, no less profound. He realized that he could honor Sarah's memory without being trapped by his grief. He could find happiness again, a new kind of happiness, with someone new. He started to participate more fully in the Seabrook community. He volunteered at the local library, helped with the annual town festival, and even joined the Seabrook Historical Society. He was no longer a ghost, a solitary figure on the fringes. He was a part of the fabric of the town, a valued member of the community. One sunny afternoon, Arthur stood on the beach with Eleanor, watching the waves crash against the shore. He took her hand and looked into her eyes. "Eleanor," he said, "will you marry me?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears of joy. She threw her arms around him and kissed him fiercely. "Yes, Arthur," she said. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Their wedding was a small, intimate affair, held in the town hall where the orchestra met. The members of the Seabrook Community Orchestra played a beautiful selection of classical music, filling the room with joy and celebration. Arthur and Eleanor exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other for the rest of their lives. As they danced to their first dance as husband and wife, Arthur looked around the room, at the faces of his friends, his family, his community. He saw the red-haired violinist Clara, wiping away tears of happiness. He saw the pink-haired teenager Liam, beaming with pride. He saw the elderly gentleman with the trombone, Mr. Peterson, raising a glass in a toast. He realized that he had found a new life in Seabrook, a life filled with love, with music, with connection. He had found healing through the power of community, through the transformative magic of music, and through the unexpected second chance at love. He held Eleanor close, his heart overflowing with gratitude. He was no longer a grieving widower, lost in the shadows of his past. He was a husband, a friend, a musician, a member of a community. He was alive again. The music swelled, filling the room with its vibrant energy. Arthur closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him, drowning out the last vestiges of his grief. He was finally free. He was finally home. And he knew with absolute certainty that Sarah would have wanted him to be happy. She would have wanted him to find love again. She would have wanted him to live. And he would. He would live with Eleanor, by his side, with the music in his heart, and with the unwavering support of his newfound community. He would live not just for himself, but for Sarah, for Eleanor, for all those who had helped him to find his way back to the light. The sea may continue to crash against the shores of Seabrook,